Hello everyone, welcome to Channeling Queer Depths, an evening with Poet Shivanee Ramlochan. Just a reminder before we get started that tonight's talk is free for everyone, but if you do enjoy the work we do, please do consider supporting Nottingham Contemporary by making a small one-off donation on your way out. My name is Philippa Douglas. I'm the Assistant Curator of Live Programmes here at Nottingham Contemporary. Before introducing Shivanee, I'd like to share some brief housekeeping notes with you. Our live programmes open up different interventions and propositions within research across the organisation. Although we will keep an informal atmosphere throughout the evening, our talks, performances and screenings seek to create challenging environments where open-mindedness and respect for each other's approaches and perspectives can foster growth. So please be mindful and respectful of each other's opinions and views. I would also like to take this opportunity to show gratitude to the University of Nottingham and Nottingham Trent University, as well as acknowledging my colleagues Janan Bator, Andy Batson, Jim Brower, Tom Chamberlain and Millie Quick for making this event possible today. So without further delay, I'm delighted to introduce Shivanee Ramlochan. Shivanee is an Indo-Trinidadian poet, critic and essayist whose first poetry collection, Everyone Knows I Am a Haunting, was shortlisted for the 2018 Forward Prize. Shivanee's next work, the creative non-fiction Unkillable, is forthcoming from Noemi Press in autumn 2023. Tonight, Shivanee will give readings from her groundbreaking collection, Everyone Knows I Am a Haunting, followed by a conversation with PhD queer literary researcher Tom Lockwood-Moran. Tom is a PhD researcher funded by Midlands Four Cities, writing his thesis in English literature entitled Queer Resistances, Contemporary Caribbean Communality. Tom's project is supervised by experts from both Nottingham Trent University and the University of Leicester. It's my pleasure to welcome you both and have you with us this evening. This event partnered with Formations Programme at Bonington Gallery. And on that note, I'm now going to hand over to Josh to say a few words before we begin.
Thank you very much, Philippa. My name's Josh Lockwood-Moran. I'm the Assistant Curator at Bonington Gallery, which is part of Nottingham Trent University. Thank you for Nottingham Contemporary for letting us host this event today with us. This event is part of our Formations Programme, which is a series of public events focused on global inequalities. This programme is organised in collaboration between Bonington Gallery and Nottingham Trent University's Post-Colonial Research Centre, led by Jenny Ramone and Nicole Tiari. All our events are recorded and available to watch on our Bonington Gallery's YouTube channel. Back in February, Shivanee and Tom had a conversation as well, so please, if you enjoyed it tonight, check that out as well. We also have a writing workshop with Shivanee tomorrow evening at Bonington Gallery, and there are 2 places left for that, so sign up if you haven't already. And on that note, I will hand over to Shivanee and Tom.
To me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? I'm always a bit anxious with mics. Hi.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Shivanee. It's really great to have you all here, and also just a big welcome for you to Nottingham. This is your first time in Nottingham.
Yes.
And we've spent a bit of the day together today already, and we've seen the show upstairs. And what we'll be thinking through and kind of talking with Shivanee today is the subterranean imaginary to do with upstairs, but also to do with thinking through about undergrounds, underneaths, subcultures, subversions within your work. And I wondered if you wanted to say hello.
Hello, everyone.
And I guess to begin, because what the structure of this event's going to be, we're going to have a little talk now, discussion, and then we're going to hear from Shivanee, who's going to read a poem for us, and then we'll just go back to discussion and poem. And we're really fortunate because Shivanee's going to be sharing some work at the end, which is brand new, that we haven't got to engage with. Well, no one's got to engage with before, and I'm really excited, as I'm sure you are. So I just wanted to start, I guess, thinking through queerness in this space, what we mean, or what you think of in terms of queerness for yourself and your writing.
Thank you for that question. Being queer in the Caribbean is an interesting proposition. It's kind of like shape-shifting. I'm not able to be queer in the same way at home, which is in Trinidad and Tobago, as I am when I'm here. It's kind of like you go through an involuntary sea change when you cross the Atlantic, and you are suddenly in a place similar to when I'm in the States, where the facts of my body and my poetry and myself are more palatable to a wider range of people, or people just don't care, which is also quite freeing. At home, it feels, every time that I return to this place that I love, where I live, where I've always lived, it kind of feels like you inhabit a wrong-sided time machine, always going back in time. I mean, with that said, a couple of years ago, Trinidad finally struck down its post-colonial laws governing sodomy, which we inherited thanks to our former colonizers right here. And it was, as a queer person who's lived her whole life in the Caribbean, it was extraordinary, but it was also terrifying, because it was that feeling of, what are you going to do if they take it away? What if it's a trick? What if it's a joke? And it's really lovely to see younger queer people, the generation just below me, kind of enter into this world where this is something that has always felt possible for them. And I think I work very hard to access some of that joy, which I hope comes through in the poems.
Yeah, I think joy is something that, queer joy is something that's very powerful. I suppose when we're thinking about what queerness is, we are thinking about LGBT people, but also beyond that, I suppose, there's an element of non-conformity. And do you find that thinking or imagining your queer self in writing, do you find that that gives you a sense of an outlet in the Caribbean, or do you feel like there's a connection or some sort of kind of underground, almost, I was thinking, I don't know, it makes me think of like tunnels, you know, tunnels of connection between people that have to do with feeling in terms of coding. Do you do that, or do you find that in your work and writing?
Thank you for that. I feel that on the page before anywhere else is where I was first able to be fully myself. So not just in the fact of my queerness, but in the fact of my weirdness, my nonconformity, my fatness, my confused relationship with faith. In writing this book, which is now astonishingly 5 years old, I determined pretty early on that if nowhere else but on the page, I would tell a certain kind of truth, which has a lot to do with the idea of the subterranean. Like, what is the truth beneath the accepted truth? I kind of liken it to, you know, we're all sitting at a dining room table, and on the surface of the table, with a clean linen tablecloth, everything seems fine, and you're having a lovely conversation with your family over Christmas dinner, but under the table, there's tentacles and fangs, and there's the world of the unsaid, and you know, and you all know sitting there that there's shit you're never going to talk about, but everyone knows, and you will choke with like the pain and the trauma of not being able to voice some of that, but it will never get said. And I was like, well, the poems can concentrate on that. And if I go through the rest of my life not being able to say things as me, then whoever embodies the poems can do that work. And maybe I will inherit some bravery that way.
Absolutely. I think that idea of like it's going to move on to everyone knows I'm a haunting, because like you were saying, everyone knows that there's stuff that you're not talking about, everybody knows, and there's something underneath that's almost feels mythical, as in like that you can't access that and bring it to the forefront. And moving to kind of your first reading for I wondered if we could think about maybe afterwards what invoking kind of mythical creatures does, or are they mythical? Like what's folkloric and traditional? Who's to say that these aren't real and you're bringing them to the surface? So, yeah.
So this poem is called Dwen Lara. Dwens in Trinidadian folklore are the spirits of unbaptized children who live on the periphery of the forest. And they're kind of used as a precautionary tale to children who are told to behave themselves or a Dwen will come to get them and drag them into the woods to live there forever. They wear straw hats that conceal most of their faces, and their feet are turned backwards, like so. So their heels point in that direction. And I spent a lot of time when I was young wondering if a Dwen would visit me. They never did. I'm still not baptized. Who knows, it might happen. But there are 3 Dwen poems in the collection, and I think they think about what would Dwens say if they could speak for themselves. Do they have their own stories to tell? Are they really evil little children, or are they scared? What do they want, and who do they love? So the Dwens in this collection are all siblings, and this is the middle child. Dwen Lara. If I write into you hard enough, the rumor murmurs that you'll come for me. If I scratch you through the water mirror, suck you under my talons, will you knock and claim me? I keep this one soft garden in my trachea vacant. I stripped speech for split gourds, choking on seeds, so you might come live in me, little lover. Come claim these metatarsal prayers. Everyone knows I am a haunting. Enact it again, you whisper, using Mora and Purple Heart to tell me. Mourn me all over, cloister to coal. Weep me upright in our wedding bower, my little bride. And I do. I take the 4 rivers of the forest by throat and algal sinew, pump the waters into my lungs. Come, I'll christen you away from the devil's doorstep. Dwen suitor, Dwen savior, Dwen dowry, Dwen, you are mine by sharp incense and pistol recoil, by moth fabric and mouth to mouth. The wooden atlas delivers deeper rings in us, while the devil tries again to win your heart, grinning. Come here, she marrow bites. I have something for you, but it looks like torture. She scrapes it from the ruins of the Moonlight Museum. She smiles as it eats our national anthem from your tongue. No one told you how it would hurt to have your feet forced against family hearth. The mangroves stroked you taut while the devil cracked your bones right. A blister body of devotion. A casket of cunning charms to stamp you for her service. I will never make you walk again, if you will be mine.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
That was really stunning. Well, I think we were talking about this before. I really enjoy a title drop. So everyone knows I'm a haunting, to be saying everyone knows I'm a haunting within that poem. Mm-hmm. Do you see and feel, is that, as much as there's a poetic voice, is that also your voice? It almost feels with the duet like you're invoking them, like you want them, because I maybe feel like they're terrifying, but I want them.
Yeah.
You know, I want them. And you were talking about kind of being a child and them taking you away.
Yeah.
As a queer child growing up in not in Trinidad, did you feel as though there could be an element of kind of the other side that would welcome you? Because for me, I've always thought of in a very white British kind of way, like early modern changelings, and that's the way that's what it made me think of. That like maybe that there's someone who can take me away and make me a fairy, you know, or fairier. So yeah, I wondered how that worked for you. Did you see something that's supposed to be scary as a potential escape?
Yes. I mean, the big joke is that I'm really frightened of horror films, but I realize that there's a lot of supernatural, mythical elements in my work. And like most children of the post-colonial empire, we grew up on a lot of British myths. My parents maybe more so than me, but I mean, I was surrounded by Enid Blyton books, I studied Keats and Shelley for English literature. I mean, I was never far from these emblems of very conventional symbolism. But, you know, within that mostly white male canon, I hunted for the fantastical.
Yeah.
For the poems that spoke about spiriting away human children and goblin markets and all of that. And when I started that long process of unlearning colonial damage, I allowed myself to go into my own Caribbean archives, which previously I'd scorned because of the associations of it being inferior. And found there was a wealth there to hold me. And the things that are often taught to children as frightening or punitive can actually be quite welcoming to those who have no other spaces in which to find themselves.
Yeah, I think there's something really important in that, in kind of those being taught a certain variation of literature or whatever that is. Is that still the same in Trinidad at the moment in terms of curriculum?
It's hard to get away from Shakespeare.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know that we ever really will, but there's much more variety now than there ever was.
But I suppose there's those kind of unusual or strange, maybe uncanny aspects that you're drawn towards. We were talking about Goblin Market, and I suppose there's a really big, I love that poem in terms of like a lesbian tension.
Yeah.
And so there's often a queer-coded threat, but that's probably based on something older, longer, and wiser, like what you're bringing through with the duet.
I feel like lesbian tension could be my code name. I live for a little bit of lesbian tension.
Yeah.
I didn't think of myself as a lesbian for a long time. I suppose I still don't. I think I exist somewhere on that strange queer gradient that doesn't really want a name, but knows it's not straight. Just because straightness was so often associated with all the things I feared most with the patriarchy, with a really punishing kind of justice handed down by men. I think it's no coincidence that the men that I fear the most are Indo-Caribbean men, whether they're real people in my extended family or archetypes. And it's because these are the figures who represented this kind of incarnate violence to me as a child growing up in rural Trinidad. These are the men I saw like stumbling out of village bars, and my family owned such a bar. So I saw this all the time, and the men I saw beating their wives, and the men I saw being taken back by those wives who were still covered like in bruises. And so the Indian man in my poems doesn't get off easily, but I've been trying a lot to figure out where that comes from and whether or not that is a well of trauma I can ever ride through. And now with the new poems, what is on the other side of that? How has the Indo-Caribbean man suffered himself and been, how has his body and his mind been the site of active trauma?
Yeah, that kind of violence begets violence. There's a darkness that begets darkness. And I suppose even when we're thinking about as queer people drawn towards this variation of darkness, there's a romanticization of it, which I think is really beautiful in your work with Duane particularly, but also I suppose when you invoke classical mythology, there's something dangerous, romantic, but also really visceral in terms of the pain that might be behind that. And this isn't, I don't know, like you were talking about putting yourself or a poetic voice that is kind of your most villainous or the darkest, the most underneath. Do you think you will be able to do that, or do you think that's for your poems to kind of write against?
That's a great question. I am never always too sure who's speaking through me or what the poems intend to do until they do it to me, which sounds like a little bit like an exorcism. But
Yeah.
like there are things in this collection that I've tried to run away from writing, but poems are this force that won't really let you sleep. And so the more I tried to resist some of this telling, the more it pursued me. Particularly, I think the poems about sexual violence. And in fact, sharing those poems after the book was published have been some of the most intense and community building, including queer community, experiences of my life, because one writes in a kind of isolation, with all your attendant demons. And then I didn't think too much about what it would be like to read the work in public until I started reading the work in public. And there were people in audiences like me, Indo-Caribbean women and girls and non-binary people, much of them closeted in Caribbean space, who would come up to me afterwards and say that they felt a part of something they hadn't been a part of before. And what I realized was that I too was invited to be part of this invisible space in which we could all be, maybe subterranean, but seen by each other in that darkness. And that darkness could be a gift.
Yeah, that's really true. I think there's something that I suppose even within our what's correspondence to our friendship to all of our stuff that's kind of there's something underneath, no matter how kind of far apart you might be geographically, or even how people might see you beyond that, I guess, if they're thinking or looking at identity markers, that actually queerness in and of itself tends to try and go past anything to do with identity, troublingly, and to do with, it can be contentious, but that it's about connecting beyond those things. And I suppose you sharing that amount of your other side, I guess, to ostensibly strangers. I suppose when you wrote, did you think about kind of strangers resonating with your work? Or can you not do that as part of the practice?
It's interesting. I feel like the poems, again, about sexual violence, I wrote because there was nowhere else to put them. I couldn't speak the truth of them to anyone who I thought would be able to receive them. I was spending so much time compressing myself as a human being into spaces to be palatable, to be thought of as obedient and docile and acceptable. So I certainly couldn't start talking about rape in the Caribbean in polite society. And I don't know if I had an ideal reader. I just felt desperate to communicate the essential truth that this kind of violence is systemic, it is domestic, it wears all kinds of deceptive faces, and it is happening all the time. And it was truly humbling to begin to see a response to that involved community. Both communities I felt a part of and also a part of. And, often when you share work about sexual violence, it is hard to evade the question of, did this happen to you? Which I always find to be a difficult thing to answer, though I understand the places where it comes from. So a lot of just the practice of living with the work in the world has been about making space for other people to share how they are moved or troubled by it, and knowing what parts of yourself need to remain subterranean, what parts of your own privacy are sovereign to you, what will you guard while you also bleed yourself, really, for someone else to witness.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, especially in terms of what you're talking about with, is this you? That question that everybody is kind of the go-to. Is this you? Who is this voice? Even as kind of a literary researcher, it's like, where's the poetic persona? What are they doing? What's happening? I guess when there's how much of your life is put into it is actually private, and poetry or your poetic expression doesn't have to do that, and maybe it doesn't need to be questioned, which is something, as we move on to the next reading, that I think is interesting to think about. Like you were saying, you don't think of yourself in any way, shape or form as lesbian, but there maybe is this lesbian tension.
Can I get a t-shirt that says lesbian tension?
Lesbian tension.
Start wearing it to reading.
Yeah, just to create that.
If I started a band called Lesbian Tension, would you join?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I've got lesbian
Okay,
tension
great.
written all over me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want this for us.
Yeah. That'll be that's the next event. Introducing lesbian
Right.
tension. I think that would go down really well, especially with me.
This poem is the oldest poem in the book. It was written in my early 20s, but a state I am decidedly far from now. And it's, when you look at your old work and you think, oh God, I'd never write a poem like this again. But actually, I was telling Tom this before the reading, that I look at this poem now and I feel immense gratitude to the young woman that I was then for daring to write it at 21 or 22, which is now more than 10 years ago. This was nothing I was daring to say to anyone. The really baby step beginnings of trying to figure out where to put my queer desire, where I would be safe putting it, and importantly, would I do it if I couldn't be safe? To which the answer turned out to be yes. Good names for 3 children. Do not go into the dark alone. Hold my hand. I don't care if it embarrasses you or makes you fret. Squirm like you are trying to crawl out of your own skin. You pull away and slice me across my Achilles' heels. 3 years later, you will fling yourself from me into the grinning gamble of oncoming traffic, and your years of being carried will rush up like starving orphans to kiss your palms. Do not go into the dark alone. Remember your right to use it. Your voice, your arms, your high street San Fernando desire for the girl with an orange blossom tucked behind her ear. Do not wake, sleep, ransacked, blary-eyed with a fraud's tears, feeling filthy for the way you love, the how, the who, the where. I cradled your strong limbs in my belly, and they tapped out against my bones the Morse code of your whole life. Remember your right to use it. Do not forget the dead. They sit at your table to stave off food poisoning. They have caught your infant from the clutches of a fumbling man. You are poised in every instant over the fertile graves of millions. Nothing will erase your mother's smile, the gate swinging open as you step off the school bus, the tug in your chest, a sea swell as you swim always towards your first love. Do not forget the dead. Corinne, Mara, Ife.
Thank you, Shivanee.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was really, it's amazing. I had no idea that was one of the first poems that the first poem probably that you'd read, the oldest in this collection is Where My Words Are Trying to Go.
Yes, it almost didn't make it in here. I was, when, it came down to selecting the chronology of poems, I just went, because, to my eye, it just really stuck out. It was so disparate from what I was trying to write 10 years after. But I thought, it's not fair to that poet, to that person, that self, to conceal something so important, just because
Absolutely.
I think now it's less polished or less sophisticated. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I don't. I think maybe that there's some form of connection that speaks out a bit easier, or a bit with a bit more vulnerability, perhaps. I guess there's also, like we was talking about just before this, it was reminding me of kind of Shani Mutu out on Main Street. This kind of, I was going to say it again, lesbian tension. this kind of underneath or underside to whatever's going on, and here kind of linking that with the dead and thinking about the other side. And I know we were talking about this earlier because I was like, it was every time I was reading or thinking about this poem, I was going back to Antoinette White Sargasso and that catch-all phrase that I think I say to myself probably like once a month, just in a really like loads of gravitas, like there's always the other side. Always. And I wondered, in this, there's so much of quite obviously of the dead, but also of a new birth coming through.
Yeah.
That is the other side, and is that other side, the people who came before and the people who come after you, always, are they writing with you? Do you think that you're writing through that, or do you think that this is just you in this particular moment in 20? Do you think you were already writing this for your future self?
Thank you for that. I mean, as far as I know, I am monoracial by ancestry, which is an interesting thing. 100% ostensibly of my ancestors came from the Indian subcontinent as indentured laborers to Trinidad, which is, I think, some people, racists, might think of as a point of pride. To me, it's always been interesting because there is no mixing as far as I'm aware. But what that means is that I've thought a lot about the Indian woman who made my bloodline what it is, what they would have given up to cross the ocean. That journey was called crossing the Kalapani, which means black water in Hindi, to a world they knew nothing about, carrying as much of their traditions as they could with them, escaping really uncertain fates. I mean, indenture was by no means slavery, but neither was it luxurious. And a lot of the journeys of indenture happened through manipulation and coercion, the promise of a life that was supposed to be markedly better in the West Indies, but was not. And so how many of these women had stories to tell that were submerged, suffused, made subterranean, not by choice? How could I ever think, in some kind of vanity or hubris, that where I write from comes from nothing, or that I was the originator of it? Maybe I used to think that way, which I think is fine. I think it's a belief of emotional and literal youth to hold on to that. But when I started to examine my traditions, both the ones that I loved and the ones that made me profoundly uncomfortable, I started thinking a lot about these stories I would never have access to. And for better or worse, I've inherited a great deal from my Indo-Caribbean ancestry, language, religion, ritual, type 2 diabetes. The good and the bad, and all of it. And part of that must be stories waiting to be exhumed. And I might never get close to knowing what my grandmother or great-great-grandmother or the first woman of my line thought of. But if I could think about that for the rest of my life and be with that, then that would be, I think, some of the most important work I could be doing.
Yeah, I think that comes through that there's, what would I be thinking through? I know that there was a word that someone used to describe your work that I was like, that's really good, but it just meant lots of voices, which is what it actually means, like multiphonic or something. You know, we were discussing this earlier, like for all intents and purposes, just wankiness of literary criticism in those terms. But that multi-chorus, maybe, like a chorus of people with you. And something that was quite interesting, actually, was when I was thinking of, when I started writing on your work, and I was thinking and putting your work and thinking, what's it going to go together, not together with, but where does it connect? It was Stacey Ann Chin of technically no kind of sameness.
Yeah.
You know, like there's no community based on sameness. What you're connecting through is difference. And I wondered whether it's these same cycle-breaking, difference women who are part of that lineage, and that they also would have had those cycle breakers informing them. So you're kind of giving a literary presence now, but does it feel, do you feel tender towards them, or do you feel angry, or if those kind of people come up for you? Though it's maybe it's too personal. You don't have to answer that if you don't want to.
Are you trying to create lesbian tension?
Yeah, I think I already have, but just with myself. I feel very lesbian and very tense.
Oh my God. It's a very fraught relationship with the ancestors, particularly the men of my family line, and also I don't want to say that the more I write, the more I wonder whether or not writing against the patriarchy can become a kind of crutch. Like if it's a crutch, I think I've borne it out of necessity. But again, talking about what is on the underside of the people who perpetrate great violence, how to do that kind of work without sympathizing with violent perpetration. Is that a word?
Yeah.
Violentness. But also making room for the fact that everyone under indenture suffered, everyone under the post-colonial projects of the empires suffered tremendously and enacted great suffering on each other. I don't know if I would be on speaking terms with all the ghosts in my family, but...
would it be nice to kind of have them in front of you to not be on speaking terms?
Yeah, because like it's a two-way street. I shouldn't assume they don't want to speak to me either. Like I could be like a radically huge disappointment. Like why aren't you?
But you want to be a disappointment.
Like why aren't you a doctor or a lawyer? Why don't you have 10 perfect Indian children?
But then you wouldn't have them in front of you because you've invoked them somehow through poetry and ritual, I guess. Or the ritual that is poetry.
Yeah, I do wonder a lot about what they would say for themselves if they could regard how they're presented in the poems. I guess I'll find out when I'm dead.
Yeah, you can come from. You
if
can have that conversation.
If I like reincarnate into a dung beetle, I'll be like, oh, okay, this is because I fucked up. Yeah. As a family archivist. I try to do it with care and with accepting that as one writer in my family, maybe the only one who goes by that title, though I don't usually. It's just one story.
Yes.
And I don't presume I speak for my mother, my father, or the rest of my family. I don't even think I speak for myself, like from 5 years ago. So the archive of what I know and understand is always being torn open for reinterrogation and re-examination. And I find things that humble me, that I have to admit I was wrong about, that shock me and confront make me confront myself. And I think this is what I think.
Yeah.
If I'm not prepared to enact the greatest difficulties of the work upon myself, I can't visit it on anyone else.
Yeah,
So I
you
wouldn't
can't
put
expect
anyone
others.
through narratively or symbolically anything in a poem I wasn't willing to go through. I think that's only fair.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also think there's something in that when you create all these voices and a story that is just yours but has so many different branches of stories, what it does is show that history is just a story, is just one version, or learned history is a version of one focus of events from his perspective. It's in the name, isn't it? His story, that old kind of where you're, and I guess it's from where you're looking at that history that it becomes, if you're looking at it from below, you're seeing you can see it as one story, and you need, in order to proliferate those voices, I guess there needs to be a number of those, but they're still you, but not you, I guess. And with that, we'll move towards, this can be brand new poetry. Is this okay?
Yes.
Yeah. This, so you wrote, was this one that you wrote
So this one is...
the Plath Fest?
Yeah, so I went to the Sylvia Plath Literary Festival last month, and one thing they did was to commission a series of poems from participating writers for an anthology called After Sylvia. And the book is roughly divided into 4 segments, each of which has a theme. The theme I was broadly responding to was rebirth. I have a complicated relationship with Sylvia Plath. When I was 16 or so and discovered her poems for the first time, I thought, no one could write like this. I fell completely in love, and I was obsessed. I used to write her poems out in my notebooks, and I thought this was the pinnacle of what a woman writer could do in poetry. And then, some years after, I read The Bell Jar, and I felt profoundly betrayed by Sylvia Plath for her, what, at the time must have been unexamined casual racism, for misogyny, for portrayals of black men that were animalistic. And I thought, I can't see myself in this world in the way I could in her poems. But so it's complex, but it's not a relationship without love, because we don't know what Sylvia what destination she might have come to in her evolution had she lived. And so it is a big question mark of whether or not that kind of writing would have been perpetuated. And I try to allow space within that love that I had and still have for her poems to be open to complexity. But one thing that I think I will always be grateful to her for was the physical and almost muscular act of taking up space without apology on the page that she taught me when I was 16 or 17. That I didn't have words to articulate then, but I knew it, and I felt it, and I felt at home in it.
It's like a don't meet your heroes thing with that, because Bell Jar is kind of, it is her, but it's not her, I guess.
Again, what we've been talking about all night, about how to reconcile different parts of yourself within yourself. So within this complicated love for Sylvia, this poem emerged. All the men who will not save you. The maker of missiles, the eroder of doubts, the quiet and triple-hipped starter of fires, the keeper of small bones and spiny growths. Him with a nesting doll full of hymens and sighs. Him with scarred hands cupped like satellites. Him in the night with your cunt in a crab catcher. The undoer of welts, the unbelter of catechisms, the one with a face full of virtuous children, the geographer who cried, shaking out your maps, them who do damage and never say sorry, them as who damage you, sorrying in little drips, them damagers with grasshopper blood sparkling on their shirt cuffs in the bright, unsuspicious sun. I have always known I would de-virgin myself best. Fist full of pens, covers leaking neon, sour like cherries sliced off the vine. A fistful of pens was my first lover. I learned much later in life that a girl cannot deflower, and so I plundered the language right out of myself first, my fist a mess of ink and blood and gel and Barbie perfume first, my nail bed sour and puckered as the mouths of saints. Let no man say he came here first. Listen to him declaim, but no, I was the original breaker of me. I took, I kept, I hoarded everything and locked the husbands out, first and last of their names and stations. Runners up in the violent arts. When I am born again to this life, you will not know me. When I come startling into the world, how precious the cry, torn from lips like a holster. Miniature guns spilling between gum work. I plan to come back here blazing, gelled in the saddle, ready to raise it down, ready to buck wild and bloody and fight. If you hold me in your arms like a promise, I'll dissolve. If you think you're going to make a bride of me, sweet boy, I'll melt.
Thank you. I mean, that's. I'm just taking a moment. I think it's.
Thank you.
It was really, that's really great. And also, again, I suppose there's that word that I went back to, springing around from the beginning, which is visceral. Mm-hmm. There's something uncompromising about how you're presenting this rebirth. Mm-hmm. That rebirth, I suppose, rebirth as like a grounding of the self. Sometimes I've read your work as kind of like birthing the self, or how and in what ways do we, especially as queer people, have to mother and father and other ourselves, not as a sense of, not in a sense of that would be best, but that it's you have to or you'll die.
Yeah.
That there's a survival aspect to it. And I wondered whether, when there's kind of a very visceral self-birthing or like having sex with yourself, mm-hmm. how do you kind of think through that in such a way that you don't end up kind of traumatizing yourself, mm-hmm. going through that kind of the rebirth? It needs to be traumatic, but do you feel grounded? Like, how do you ground yourself when you're doing that?
So many inappropriate answers in my head. Just filtering them out.
You can do an inappropriate answer, there's no...
I don't know if I can.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
I
might be arrested.
Oh, really?
Listen, I feel like one of the best things about doing this work is the community I get to do it in, which is a very sharp departure from how I thought I would write. Mm-hmm. I thought for years I wouldn't show this work to anyone, that it was too strange, too weird, too queer, too freaky. Nobody would want it. Nobody would want to hold it. But I have come to understand that it is okay to be held in queer community. Mm-hmm. And as a person who has problems just generally with being held, as I think, like that traditional first daughter syndrome, you care for others, you are always in the process of taking care of problems, whether you've been asked to or not. Always one with the schedule, with the clipboard, with the itinerary, with the to-do list. When someone dies, you're the one in the family who holds shit together. And so that means you don't hold yourself together, of course. And you are like this exquisite mess just walking around.
Giving, but not.
Yeah. And in the queer poetry community is where I found unsolicited tenderness. And it was terrifying at first because I don't succumb easily to giving myself that grace, I guess. But here are writers who are also writing similar and different things, often coming to the same conclusions, that we need each other, that if we are going to be forced underground, forced into caves not of our own making, we just light that bitch up, like put fairy lights everywhere and like stripper poles and just
100%,
like furs and decorate the place
like
and
a
go
black
wild.
light.
Make the home that you're forced into more hospitable.
Yes.
Especially when some of us, not me, but were ejected from their actual homes, you know. And so there are homes in the poems and in different kinds of art where I thought I can reconcile the most monstrous parts of myself with each little monster deserves some kind of love. And I can get to that because I'm not alone.
Absolutely, and each monster deserves their layer as well, where they might kind of come up and get someone else, you know, and drag them down or not.
Yeah.
But that being dragged down into a cave isn't always a negative.
No.
You know, and actually coming out into the light can be the most toxic thing or the most hurtful thing ever. I guess there's like cave allegories on cave allegories, and again, you can go to like, let's go to philosophy, but let's not, you know? Let's just have it be a beautiful, monstrous underground layer.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That was really... Do you feel... I know you were talking about kind of a difficult or complex relationship with Sylvia Plath.
Yeah.
Did you find, in that visceral nature, did you find a sense of peace with that? It felt like you could kind of... while you were... There's like a vicious way of having sex with yourself that might also be kind of exercising something, Sylvia, out of you.
I think so. I think Sylvia and I have reached an accord because she's, you know, she was an important ghost to me for a long time, but I think I've realized she was no more an important ghost than my ancestors, you know. And there's a poem, a newish poem called Canefield, which kind of tries to exhume some of the ghosts of indenture. And I think a lot about what Sylvia would think of those women. And I, you know, again, if I could speak to ghosts, I would be like, you can write whatever you want, Sylvia, but you have to witness other women in the world.
Yes, you have to witness, and you have
and
to...
And you know, who knows what conclusions she's come to in her afterlife.
True.
Maybe she is just fully enlightened, floating around.
Yeah, she could be here. How did you find that at Plathfest as a thing, I suppose, because it's such a... venerate.
Ooh, that's an interesting question.
Which perhaps isn't for public consumption, but we'll see. Maybe ask after, who knows?
I did say something similar to what I shared.
Oh, really?
And I think I was the only voice that I heard offer something that was not full of adulation. But I wasn't stoned.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, that's good. And the thing is, it's okay to have these heroes in whatever way that people want to have and to criticize them. No one's saying, get rid of them. People are saying, let's talk about them for real. There's another slide that I think had your writing from The Good Brown Girl from Brave New Words. And I just wanted, I guess, that was very much thinking, again, where we've been returning to this evening about kind of the persona and the self and the mining that comes with that.
Yeah.
You're also writing at the moment, or you're in the finishing stages of a piece of creative non-fiction. So how much do you think with non-fiction, can there be non-fiction that isn't creative, I guess?
Ooh. No, probably not. This book, Unkillable, is about Indo-Caribbean...
Great title, by the way, it's so fucking good.
Indo-Caribbean women's disobedience across 3 generations. My grandmothers, one of whom is alive, one of whom is in the spirit world, my mother, and myself. And it's... The real contention with nonfiction is your fidelity to the truth. And again, as we've discussed, the truth is a multiple and confounding thing, right? It's what happens above and beneath the dining room table of your life. And what do I owe to people who are still alive, who will read this work and interact with it and have feelings about it? Can I ever truly distill a person and their experiences through my own imperfect lens into something that is honorable and valuable? And I don't know the answers to those questions, but I know I have to try to do it. And I can only do it through this process of research and inquiry and sitting with the woman in my family line and going through documents and thinking obsessively about what we owe to others and what we owe to ourselves and what we owe to the truth that needs to be told.
I think within that section of writing, again, you talk about the kind of like the unfuckwithable.
Yes.
That's it, unfuckwithable talisman of things. And I think that's something that is powerful and is something that can really, anybody can kind of bring up through your work, regardless, is that you can mine the deepest recesses of yourself, and it's okay to find that and also be unfuckwithable.
Yeah, because everyone is. You all are.
Yeah.
You are. We all are.
You're all unfuckwithable.
We should have T-shirts that say that.
Unfuckwithable.
Give them out.
Yeah, maybe that could
like
be
throw them into the crowd.
warm-up act, lesbian tension.
And I feel like the workshop that I'm offering tomorrow is very much about that. And that workshop kind of began as a permissory act to myself, just coming up with exercises I could do to get these difficult truths on the page. And then each exercise was a way of saying, you can do this, and the world will not end. And you can do this, and there might be consequences, and some of them might be shitty, but you'll have the work.
Yeah.
And you're capable of doing this, and here's how you can also take care of yourself in the aftermath of doing this work. Even if you are the only person you know who can hold you, you'll still be able to hold yourself, and you'll have the writing. And that has to be worth something.
Absolutely, and you'll have your own home. You'll have your own little monster layer to go back to. Well, we haven't got any more readings. We were going to kind of pass on for any question and answers, any comments that anyone would like to bring in from what we've been talking about. You feeling good? That was great.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that.
That was lovely.
Thank you so much. I guess if we were going to continue talking through what Unkillable means for you at the moment, so that's the next text that you've got coming up. That's coming out next year.
Yes.
And if anyone?
Hi, how you doing?
Hello.
I saw you speaking at Bocas Lit Fest the other day with Anthony Joseph.
Yes.
I think it was. And you were talking about family, and I was interested in what he was saying about how his poetry gave him, or even though his dad wasn't there, he was kind of, the presence was there in the poetry, and that was his way of dealing with it. So I was wondering how that has helped you, maybe, or how it is helping you with this current work, in terms of capturing people that you weren't necessarily present in your life. I mean, you've kind of spoken about ancestors and things like that, but just talking about the effects that the writing has, maybe.
Thank you for that question. And thanks for being at Focus UK. I think it went really well. Unlike Anthony, both my parents are extremely present in my life, which is not to say I've always had an easy relationship with either of them. But writing about my immediate family is a different prospect because of the intense immediacy, and also because I know that when this book comes out, they will see things about themselves that we haven't really shared vocally, but we know the feelings exist, particularly my fraught but deeply loving relationship with my father, and my deeply loving, hardly ever fraught, but very intense relationship with my mother, and how I am this composite of, as their eldest child, their hopes and dreams for me, which must have gone terribly wrong, but then kind of righted themselves, sort of. I mean, they're very proud of me, but I do sometimes see expressions of horror in their faces when I read my work. And I think, oh God, when is this girl going to write a happy poem? And I'm very grateful to them for their support. I couldn't do any of this without it. And it's a very special kind of support because it's unconditional, but doesn't pretend to understand everything. And so whatever gets into this book, into the groundwater of it, will be informed by that trust. But I'm trying to figure out a way to not be beholden to it, to tell the truth of our family as much as I can, without thinking because I have this support, it means I need to frame them in a particular way. Maybe this is something that all memoirists go through. I don't know. I don't know. I have my own place, so if they don't want to see me for a little while, I'll be fine. But I think it will be fine. I think there must be a way to do this with love and integrity. And that's what I'm trying to reconcile. And while I've been here, I've written some of the most difficult stuff for the book. And that was intentional, to be away from Trinidad for a while, to kind of look at it better from a distance and think, I love this country, and it's also a difficult place to be, which is true of the family. I love my family, but sometimes it's difficult, and how to just treat it with patience and discipline and love, ultimately, is what I try to come back to.
That's right. Yeah, so I guess when you're talking about memoir as well, it's a really interesting, I was talking about Stacey Ann Chin, I hadn't thought about it yet, but of course, her memoir is such a kind of visceral, again, it doesn't show anybody in necessarily the best light, but it also gives a kind of map to survival.
It does.
Which I believe that some of your kind of poetry and writing does anyway, so it'll be really exciting, I think. And it'll be really healing for a lot of people to see that in a narrative way, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other? Yeah, great.
Yay.
I wanted to ask a bit more technical question, if I can. As I noticed that most of your lines, or they struck me as being used quite a lot of enjambment, and that it's rare for your poetic lines to end with a nice, clean ending. And not only, but more than that, they often end with kind of like quite, almost like functional words, like, for and if. So the punch of your poems often come mid-line rather than the traditional end of the line. And it's like, it happened so often in the poems you were reading, I was wondering, like, what you feel the poetic line offers you in that way. Like, because it seems like it's quite a conscious choice to avoid certain, sort of like poetic conventions.
There was a definite style of poetry that we studied. I went to a Roman Catholic convent school in Trinidad. Got a very prestigious education that was very post-colonial. And I loved Keats as much as anybody else. I did love him a lot, actually. I mean, yeah, a lot, to be fair. But I felt deprived of our own Caribbean canon of poetry as a 17 or 18-year-old. And so when I started pursuing in university, the books we were studying were very Caribbean, the Caribbean and its diaspora. And I just read everything I could voraciously in and outside of that. And because storytelling has always been so oral in the Caribbean, I also sought out poems that were rarely transcribed into books. Like a lot of the early poetics of Linton Kwesi Johnson, for example, of performers who made their name and did the hard graft through oral tradition. And the line just became a thing to be respected, but also to be subverted. And it felt feminist to do that work. It felt, you're very right to say it was intentional. It was absolutely intentional. It felt that each line needed to be as unpredictable as weather, as because some of the poems were trying to channel a panic of a loss of breath. And I thought, how could I do that across the lines and sustain that tension that needed to tell a certain kind of truth? And so, yeah, I love this question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me before about my lines, and they mean a lot to me. I think they've served my work very well. I almost feel guided by them sometimes, by the form of the poem showing me a way through to the end or to the next poem. And so it's a real, happily codependent relationship we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your readings and answering all these beautiful
You're
questions. I'm Geeta, and a lot of the things that you've shared about being a queer, brown, femme, first female child resonated deeply with me. I'm from Singapore, or I should say I was born in Singapore, but I do have this lineage and heritage from India, as I think is most visible in my face. And I was wondering, your experience has traveled so much across the queer brown diaspora. How do you write within and outside of the colonial gaze or the white gaze, as Toni Morrison talks about?
That's a beautiful question, Geeta. Thank you. I was just in Singapore for the Writers' Festival, and it was lovely and pleasantly hot, like home. And then I came back here. And I'm very happy to be here. I just wish I could have brought some of that climate to share with all of you. That's a wonderful question. And I do struggle. I think it would be honest to admit that it's not always easy. Some of these new poems talk about desire for white men, which is a difficult thing to reconcile, to admit as being true to myself, and how that desire has almost always been like a twin blade of helpless eroticism and intense fear. So there's a symbolic persona of a border patrol agent who occurs in poems, who the narrator of those poems perceives a sexual relationship with, but that leads to incredible violence. And it feels like my mother would like you all to know this is not me and my relationship with any real border patrol agent. She just finds that important to put out there. Actually, she said, maybe for this new book, what I could do is write like a little pamphlet of disclaimers. Like, these things did not happen to my daughter. How to resist the seduction of empire as personified in a white cisgender man who is conventionally attractive. How to be honest and proud about my lineage while admitting there are things about white tradition that are deeply seductive. I don't ever want to pretend that I have it figured out, or that I'm immune to it, or that I don't feel tormented. It's been very hard for me to have any kind of relationship with an Indian man who is not my father or my brothers because of the intense fear that I felt growing up from faceless but all too specific other Indian men. And I'm so glad that my father and my brothers are who they are, because I can't imagine not loving them. But you mentioned Toni, and I think that the root of the answer is in there. So I reach for women, black women, women of color, non-binary writers who've done this work for generations. I reach for Toni, for Octavia, for the poet I, for Dion Brand, and these are my foremothers. I had a really hard time saying that I ever had a mentor. It was something I really rebelled against, but I do have this really powerful poetic lineage that I write into. And I feel like with these badass women, kind of like in like those angels, they're kind of like at the top of cathedrals sometimes.
Yeah, like a saint.
And they're usually all white, of course. It's like, picture that, but it's like Toni Morrison and Dion Brand up there.
And an Audre Lorde, you can have an Audre Lorde.
And Audre Lorde, telling you it's going to be okay. Like, we did this. We figured our way through this, and you will too. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I wondered how, I guess, in terms of these relationships, or between kind of academics working in post-colonial scholarship, such as me and others that will be in the room, like how does that dynamic play out for you? Because often it's something that people are maybe afraid to talk about, or like, I'm so white, what am I doing here? Or that's the way it feels. It's almost like sometimes that colonial gaze is also it's in me, or it's in whoever sat here. And how do you navigate that, I guess?
I have increasingly less time for bigots, as we were discussing.
Yeah.
I've learned the hard way how to absent myself from a space where I don't feel comfortable. And I just suffered through a lot of awkward, racialized interactions early on in my writing career, which I won't do now. And if I weren't comfortable with you in particular ways, we couldn't have this conversation.
No.
And it's about research. I research a lot more than I used to. It's about trusting other people to lead me to safe connections with white scholars.
Yeah. I guess, again, there's something underground about that, isn't there? I think that tends to be something that people don't necessarily always see.
Yeah.
That there are ways in which you can navigate away from someone underneath without them even knowing. And that's important.
Which is not happening now.
No, never. Were there any more questions? It's completely up to you.
Sure.
Yeah, if you're...
New or old?
You just... Ooh. It's... I suppose you just talked... That's quite heavy. You just talked about the Border Patrol.
I'm not going to read that.
I was going to say, that's not the way to end, is it?
It's a little bleak.
Oh, Canefield, because you talked about Canefield could be good.
Yeah.
If that's okay, if you're sure. Thank you.
Of course. So Canefield was appeared in Wasafiri's Afterlives of Indenture issue, which was edited by Andil Gosain and Nalini Mohabir. And this is the poem I was talking about when I said I'd present this to Sylvia Plath and say, this is my ancestry. These are the women you can't ignore. And so you'll hear some names of Indian women who, and these names have fallen out of conventional fashion. They're thought of as old-fashioned and not very attractive anymore, but to me they are beautiful, and they hold generations of history and endurance and joy and power. And Canefield is a real reckoning with my beloved dead, and I've only really started to read it this tour, actually. And what I hope is that in sharing my relationship with the ghosts of indenture, that you all feel well accompanied by your own beloved dead, and that no matter where they are well fed and watered. Canefield. The girl that rises from the cane field will have blood on her thighs. Don't run from her ghost. Stop. Stand there in the tall sugar. Let her taste your sweat. Let her lick the litany of your children's names from your diamond-cut barrel. Her name is Kalauti. Fit, bony knees like sharp moth wings. Drowned in the village well, her first year on this island, heavy, pregnant, and 13. Her name is Indrawati, heavy voice of hot key honeying each bhajan. Hair scraped back from her forehead with the flat of her hand, anointed in coconut oil. Holy Mandir woman of ragged nails, who died of field work, housework, bed work, collapsed face down in the ghee vat at 30. Her name, too, is secret. Her name is her father picking up a cutlass and telling her to run. Her name is the bareness of her feet on the rain-drunk brown earth, a splattering of terrors slicking from the pitch pine floorboard to the unpaved yard. And her name is in the pulse of the dolak, Her name is what she hears from the puja down the dirt road while fleeing from that killing. And though she has been dead before the end of indenture, if you find yourself in the cane fields past midnight, she may give you her name, her secret name. She may tell you how she was killed. She may show you the site where she was held down. And it is your job not to look away. And it is your job to listen. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. That bit. I did that thing. We said this at the beginning. You know what? It's my weird shaped head. That was really amazing. I think right at the end there, I've always felt that that kind of almost repetition it wants to do in my head constantly. If it's your job to listen, it's your job to watch. I think that's something that's really important to take away from what we've been thinking about all together tonight. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Were there any more questions? Or
We have time for one more question.
Oh, great,
so,
cool.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yay.
Hi, thank you so much
Hello.
for your talk today. I just wanted to
welcome.
ask you to kind of end it on a good note. What are you hopeful for in terms of your work and in terms of the world?
Wow.
That's a nice way to end. Thank you.
Amazing.
Yeah.
In 2018, when they repealed the sodomy laws in Trinidad, like I said, I couldn't imagine that would have happened. And it kind of opened up this space of hope in me for what else could be made possible in my islands. There's a way in which Caribbean people have felt they've always needed to emigrate to survive, especially if they're queer. Like, you live elsewhere to breathe more freely in your own skin. And while I would never repudiate any Caribbean person for whom that was true, I really hope that we can begin to live more freely in our own islands, on our own land. So, I mean, if in 2018 I couldn't believe those laws would be repealed, why could I not start believing that gay marriage could be made possible in Trinidad, or that even before that, protection in the workplace for people of LGBTQ plus ideation, or that trans rights would begin to be taken seriously across the Caribbean archipelago. I really want the Caribbean and its diaspora to start feeling like a riotously joyful place for people to be and to exist and to come back home to if they want to, and to write all the books and make all the plays and do all of the legalized sex work, which is also not legal in the Caribbean, at home. Home could be anywhere. I mean, home could be here. Home is like psychogeographical as much as anything else. But I think if there are people suffering across the world because they don't feel that they can come home, I want more of us to be able to come home. And I think in a way that's maybe true for what I want for my writing as well. There are ways I speak here or in the US that I wouldn't speak about my own writing in Trinidad. And I'd like to be freer and more unapologetic and more unfuckwithable about that. And I hope I will be. I'm going to try to be.
You will be, yeah. I think that's a really beautiful way to end, and thank you for that. And thank you for everyone's questions. Also, thank you to Nottingham Contemporary for having us. Thank you, Shivanee. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'd just like to say a big thank you to Shivanee for all the beautiful readings and everything you've shared with us this evening, as well as Tom for creating such an interesting and engaging discussion around Shivanee's work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
Thank you.